Welcome to Compact History from compacthistories.com, where we explore the stories, events, and moments that shaped the world in short, bite-sized episodes. This is episode 106, The History of Surnames. Names are personal things. They are the verbal equivalent of a handshake, a nod across a crowded room, and sometimes a necessary reminder that yes, this child belongs to you. But first names alone can only take society so far. Introduce more than one John into a village, and suddenly everyone is shouting, "John!" into the crowd, hoping the right one looks up. To solve this chaos, humanity invented something clever. Surnames grew out of the need for distinction, identity, administration, arguments over inheritance, and perhaps a few nosy neighbours who simply liked knowing which family someone belonged to. The story of surnames is really the story of civilization itself. It reflects how people lived, worked, organised, and judged one another. It reveals migration patterns, social hierarchies, occupations, and occasionally the embarrassing nickname that stuck far longer than anyone intended. This is the history of surnames, a surprisingly fascinating journey through language, fashion, bureaucracy, and human stubbornness. In the ancient world, most individuals got by with a single name. Kings and queens certainly did. Cleopatra, Jesus, Julius Caesar. Admittedly, Caesar eventually functioned a bit like a surname, but you get the idea. Names were unshared badges of identity because communities were relatively small and everyone already knew one another. As populations grew, complications arose. More Johns, more Marys, more confusion. You can only point and shout, "No, the other one," so many times before innovation becomes necessary. So people began to invent tag-on identifiers: John the Smith, Mary of the Oaks, Alfred, son of Alfred. These were not surnames yet. They were descriptive add-ons used casually and inconsistently. But they were the seeds. The medieval period is where surnames truly began to take shape. With expanding towns, large estates, taxation, legal documents, and growing church administration, record-keeping suddenly needed greater accuracy. Officials could not rely on "Will the real John please stand up?" happening every time a deed was signed or a tax was demanded. Norman influence in England after 1066 helped accelerate the adoption of surnames, since the Normans already used hereditary family names. The ruling elite's habits trickled down the social ladder. If you wanted to look respectable or keep the tax collector from confusing you with the wrong villager who owed triple the amount, adopting a consistent surname was a smart move. By the 13th and 14th centuries, many parts of Europe saw surnames become hereditary. Once a name stuck to a family, it tended to stay there for generations, unless altered by marriage, migration, or a clerk with poor handwriting. Surnames usually evolved along four main patterns. Think of them as the standard menu choices for medieval name creation. Some societies mixed and matched, but these categories explain most European surnames today. Patronymic and matronymic surnames are based on a parent's name, most commonly the father. Essentially, they say, "belonging to that guy." Examples include Johnson in England, MacDonald in Scotland, O'Neill in Ireland, Ivanov in Russia, and Fernandez in Spain. Matronymic names, based on the mother, were less common but not unheard of, especially where the mother held a higher status or when the father was unknown or inconveniently absent. Over time, many of these names stopped sounding like "son of" as languages evolved. For instance, the "son" ending in English stayed very clear, while the Celtic prefixes like "mac" or "o" turned into cultural badges of honour. Occupational surnames in the medieval period could be seen as a form of advertising. If your job was interesting, important, or at least recognisable, congratulations, it might become your surname. Smith, Taylor, Carter, Baker, Cooper. These names tell the story of a community's economic backbone. Also, Smith is common virtually everywhere metal was hammered, which might explain why half the phone book reads like a blacksmith convention. Where a person lived could also influence the chosen surname, as could any nearby topographical features: hill, wood, town, York. If a family moved, the name served as a postcard from the past: the Browns from the town of Brown, the people of Greenfield who no longer lived anywhere near a field. Sometimes the name even survived long after the landmark was forgotten, leaving genealogists scratching their heads and wandering around car parks that used to be forests. Surnames could also be derived from names given to you by others. People have always enjoyed giving each other descriptive nicknames: short, long, red hair, noble beard. Congratulations, that might become your surname for generations. Armstrong implies strength. Goodman implies honesty. Swain originally referenced a youthful knightly servant. Not all nickname surnames were flattering. A medieval fellow cursed with the name Cruikshank might have wished his neighbours had been just a little more polite. Although this episode of the podcast focuses primarily on the European naming explosion of the Middle Ages, surnames evolved globally in fascinating ways. China has used family names for thousands of years. Some Chinese surnames are among the oldest in the world and incredibly common. The legendary 100 Family Surnames text, first compiled in the Song dynasty, highlights how deeply rooted surnames were in Chinese social structure. In Japan, surnames were historically reserved for nobility until the late 19th century. When the Meiji government required commoners to adopt surnames, many families picked beautiful nature-themed names. This is why so many Japanese surnames reference mountains, rivers, forests, and fields. In parts of the Arabian Peninsula, naming traditions reflect tribe, lineage, and religious affiliation. Names can include multiple elements indicating ancestry across generations. In Iceland, the patronymic system lives on proudly. A child called Jonsson is literally son of John, while Jonsdottir is daughter of John. Family names do not freeze across generations the way they do in much of Europe. Icelandic phone books are alphabetized by first name too, which feels quite refreshingly personal. Later, as states centralized power, surnames became essential. Tax systems improved. Land ownership needed to be recorded. Soldiers needed to be listed. Churches kept baptism and marriage registers. Bureaucrats demanded structure. Some governments forced surnames upon populations that did not traditionally use them. This sometimes led to whimsical or unfortunate results. In the 18th and 19th centuries, Jewish families across Europe were required by law to choose official surnames. Wealthier families were sometimes able to select elegant, nature-inspired names. Poorer families occasionally ended up naming themselves after mundane objects given by unkind officials. Under colonial administrations, indigenous populations were also given names that often ignored or erased native naming traditions. Surnames in many former colonies today bear marks of this historical pressure. Whenever people crossed borders, moved to new cities, or encountered bureaucrats with different alphabets, surnames transformed, sometimes dramatically. Imagine arriving at Ellis Island in the early 1900s. You speak no English, your surname contains accents the clerk has never seen, and your life-saving paperwork relies entirely on a stranger's handwriting skills. Overseas records show a kaleidoscope of variant spellings. Some families embraced the change. Others never even noticed until decades later, when someone dug up an old document and thought they were looking at the wrong ancestor. Literacy rates, clerical errors, phonetics, and pure laziness all influenced surname evolution. Sometimes an extra letter sneaked in. Sometimes one vanished. Sometimes Brewster, with a W, turned into Brewster with a UI just because cold ink smudged. Names are more than labels. They can carry prestige or prejudice. Throughout history, certain surnames indicated nobility, property ownership, clan membership, or association with a respected profession. Others could expose a lower status, a particular trade, or a minority background. People often change their surnames to improve their social standing, integrate into a new community, or escape discrimination. Stage names, especially among actors and performers, show how a name can be shaped into a brand. Even today, surnames can hint at heritage and identity. A double-barreled surname may suggest a family eager to preserve multiple lineages. Meanwhile, some newlyweds combine their surnames to invent entirely new ones, proving that surname evolution is still alive and occasionally very creative. So, what do surnames mean today? They remain necessary for legal identification. They link families across generations and help organize society, much like they did centuries ago. Yet their role continues to shift. In many cultures, women traditionally take their husband's surname upon marriage, though modern practices vary widely. Some couples swap names, merge names, or keep their own. Studies have also shown a rise in parents giving children the mother's surname as traditions adapt to reflect contemporary family dynamics. Technology has added new layers to the story. Digital genealogy, DNA testing, and massive global databases now allow people to trace surname origins and migration paths with a level of precision that medieval record keepers could only dream about. So, why do surnames matter? Surnames are tiny time capsules. They store information about long-ago lives. A name like Fisher hints that someone in your family fished for a living centuries before you ever considered popping to the supermarket. A name that begins with MC or Mac might connect you to Celtic roots stretching back to rugged highlands and clan loyalties. Behind every surname is a narrative. Sometimes heroic, sometimes mundane, sometimes ridiculous. All of it human. The history of surnames is a history of how people have tried to make sense of one another's identity. It is about identity, power, community, and, occasionally, medieval villagers being a bit too honest about your physical flaws. Surnames once solved a practical problem. Now they remind us that we are part of something larger. They tether us to ancestors who forged iron, tilled fields, crossed oceans, and signed their names on fragile paper, hoping that future generations would remember who they were. And if your surname happens to descend from an embarrassing medieval nickname about smelly shoes or unusual teeth, take comfort in this. You would not be alone. At least your surname survived, unlike those shoes. That brings us to the end of this episode of Compact History, part of the Compact Histories network. If you enjoyed it, please follow or subscribe wherever you're listening so you don't miss any future episodes, and consider leaving a rating or review, as it really helps new listeners find the show. You can find more episodes at compacthistory.com, where you can also explore our other podcasts covering biographies, warfare, disasters, mysteries, and true crime. You can also follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and Pinterest. Finally, please consider supporting the show directly by buying us a coffee. Head on over to compacthistories.com/historycoffee to see how. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you next time.